In 1910, a man named Abraham Flexner published a report that would determine who was allowed to practice medicine in the United States. He visited all 155 medical schools in the country. He evaluated their facilities, their curricula, their faculty, and their admission standards. Based on his findings, he recommended that the majority of them be shut down. Within 25 years, more than half were gone. By 1935, only 66 medical schools remained from the 160 that had existed in 1904. The report was published by the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching. It was funded by some of the wealthiest men in American history. And here is the detail that reframes the entire story. Abraham Flexner was not a doctor. He was not a scientist. He was not a medical educator. He held a bachelor's degree in classics from Johns Hopkins University, and he ran a for-profit preparatory school in Louisville, Kentucky. That is the man who decided what American medicine would become. The report is still available. It is titled Medical Education in the United States and Canada, Carnegie Foundation Bulletin Number 4. It is 346 pages long. It contains Flexner's evaluations of every medical school he visited, including specific descriptions of laboratory conditions, teaching hospitals, and financial solvency. Many of those descriptions are devastating. Some are a single paragraph dismissing an entire institution. The language is precise, clinical, and final. To understand what the Flexner report replaced, you need to understand what American medicine looked like before it. In 1900, there were approximately 160 medical schools operating in the United States. They taught different systems. Allopathic medicine, the system we now call conventional or Western medicine, was one approach. But there were also 22 homeopathic medical schools. There were eclectic medical schools which combined herbal remedies, physical therapy, and minor surgery. There were osteopathic schools. There were schools that taught electromagnetic therapy, hydrotherapy, and physiomedicalism. The medical landscape was not a single system. It was a marketplace of competing approaches, and patients chose among them. Not all of these schools were good. Many were proprietary, privately owned for profit, with minimal admission standards and no clinical training. Some graduated students who had never performed a physical examination on a living patient. A student could earn a medical degree in some institutions after 16 months of lectures, with no laboratory work and no hospital experience. The Journal of the American Medical Association began publishing failure rates on state licensing examinations in 1904, and some schools had failure rates exceeding 50%. The quality problem was real, and it was documented. In 1904, the American Medical Association established its Council on Medical Education and began rating schools. By 1906, the Council had personally inspected all 160 institutions and classified them into 3 tiers: Class A, acceptable; Class B, improvable; and Class C, beyond repair. The Council rated 82 schools as Class A. The worst were already failing. Reform was genuinely needed. That part of the story is not in dispute. What is in dispute is who controlled the reform, what model they chose, and who paid for it. In 1908, Henry Pritchett, president of the Carnegie Foundation, selected Abraham Flexner to conduct the survey. Pritchett chose Flexner not for medical expertise, he had none, but for his writing ability and his views on education reform. Flexner had published a critique of American colleges in 1908 called The American College, which argued for rigorous academic standards over vocational training. Pritchett saw in Flexner someone who would apply the same philosophy to medicine. Flexner spent 18 months visiting every medical school in the country. His model for what a medical school should be was Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, where he had earned his bachelor's degree and where his brother Simon Flexner had trained. Simon Flexner was not a minor figure. He was a pathologist who served as the first director of the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research, established in 1901. He was also one of the original trustees of the Rockefeller Foundation. The man who wrote the report that reshaped American medicine had a brother who ran Rockefeller's Medical Research Institute. That connection is documented, it is not disputed, it is simply not emphasized. The Flexner report recommended that medical education be standardized around the Johns Hopkins model. 4 years of university-level training, a strong foundation in laboratory science, clinical rotations in teaching hospitals, and full-time faculty conducting research. Schools that could not meet these standards, which required enormous capital investment, were told to close or merge. The report recommended reducing the number of medical schools from 155 to 31. The schools that could not afford to modernize were overwhelmingly the ones that served marginalized communities and taught alternative approaches. Of the 7 medical schools that trained black physicians, Flexner recommended closing 5. Only Howard University and Meharry Medical College survived. A 2020 study published in JAMA Network Open estimated that the 5 closed black medical schools, had they remained open, would have trained between 27,000 and 35,000 additional black physicians between their closure dates and 2019. The physician shortage in black communities that persists today traces a direct line back to 1910. The homeopathic schools were devastated. There were 22 in 1900. By 1923, only 2 remained. By 1950, all had closed. The eclectic schools were gone within 30 years of the report. Naturopathic programs were marginalized. Schools teaching electromagnetic therapy, phototherapy and hydrotherapy were defunded and shuttered. The entire landscape of American medical practice was consolidated into a single model, the biomedical model, funded by industrial philanthropy and enforced through accreditation. And here is where the money enters the story. In 1912, 2 years after the report was published, Abraham Flexner joined the Rockefeller-funded General Education Board. This is the same General Education Board chartered by John D. Rockefeller in 1903, the same organization whose architect Frederick Taylor Gates wrote about producing workers with perfect docility. Over the next 25 years, Flexner helped direct more than $500 million in grants, roughly $6 billion in today's dollars, to medical schools that adopted the model his report had prescribed. The first grants went to Johns Hopkins in 1913. The money followed the recommendations. The recommendations followed the money. John D. Rockefeller had a specific interest in medicine. His Standard Oil empire had produced vast quantities of petrochemicals, and the emerging pharmaceutical industry was built on petrochemical derivatives. A medical system organized around laboratory science, pharmacology, and patentable treatments aligned with Rockefeller's industrial interests in ways that a medical system built around herbal remedies, homeopathic dilutions, or manual therapies did not. This is not a conspiracy. Nobody sat in a room and said, "Let us destroy alternative medicine so we can sell drugs." Nobody had to. The economics did the work by themselves. A system that requires expensive laboratory equipment, Proprietary pharmaceuticals and the hospital infrastructure generates revenue at every level. A system built on herbs, water cures, and patient self-management does not. Now, the fair objection. The reforms produced genuine improvements. Before the Flexner Report, some medical schools were genuinely dangerous. Graduating students who had never observed a surgery, never studied anatomy on a cadaver, never set foot in a hospital ward. The standardization of medical education raised the floor. Surgical outcomes improved. Infectious disease treatment advanced dramatically in the decades following the reforms. The germ theory of disease, which the Johns Hopkins model emphasized, led to antiseptic techniques that saved countless lives. The integration of laboratory science into clinical practice was not a corporate plot. It was a genuine scientific advancement, and the physicians trained under the new model were, on average, more competent than many trained under the old one. These gains are real, documented, and should not be dismissed. The progressive reformers who pushed for higher standards were not villains. Many were physicians who had watched patients die under the care of poorly trained graduates and wanted something better. The argument that all 160 schools deserve to survive on their merits does not hold. Some were genuinely harmful. But here is what the humanitarian narrative does not address. The same reforms that raised quality also restricted supply. In 1904, there were 28,000 medical students in the United States. By 1920, there were 13,800. The number of practicing physicians per capita dropped and has never fully recovered. The United States today has approximately 2.6 physicians per 1,000 people. The average across developed nations is significantly higher. The AAAMC projects a shortage of up to 86,000 physicians by 2036. Meanwhile, the average medical student graduates with $200,000 in debt from a 4-year program that costs between $160,000 and $272,000 in tuition alone. The restriction of supply did exactly what restricting supply always does. It raised prices. Economist Milton Friedman described the AMA as a government-sanctioned guild or trade cartel that manipulates markets for the benefit of its members at the expense of the general population. The Flexner Report gave the AMA the mechanism to enforce that cartel. Accreditation standards so expensive that only well-funded, university-affiliated institutions could meet them. Everyone else was closed. I want to be careful here because the point is not that laboratory science was wrong or that medical standards should never have been raised. The point is that a genuine quality problem was used as the justification for a restructuring that went far beyond quality. A restructuring that eliminated entire traditions of medicine, restricted the supply of physicians, consolidated control in the hands of a few institutions, and created a financial architecture that benefits every entity involved except the patient who cannot afford to see a doctor. I spent 10 days with this material before I could find the structural argument, not because the facts are hidden. The Flexner Report itself is freely available from the Carnegie Foundation's archive. The JAMA study on black medical school closures is published and peer-reviewed. Flexner's employment at the General Education Board is a matter of public record. My difficulty was distinguishing the genuine reform from the structural capture, because they happened simultaneously in the same report funded by the same people, and they are almost impossible to separate. Every time I found a damning connection, Flexner's brother running Rockefeller's Institute, the Carnegie Foundation selecting a non-physician to evaluate physicians, the money flowing to Johns Hopkins before the ink was dry, I also found a legitimate argument for why those reforms were needed. The worst medical schools were genuinely terrible, and yet the solution did not merely eliminate the worst. It eliminated everything that was not the model preferred by the people paying for the report. What I kept returning to was the timeline. In 1901, the AMA reorganizes to become a more effective national body. In 1903, Rockefeller charters the General Education Board. In 1904, the AMA creates its Council on Medical Education and begins rating schools. In 1908, the Carnegie Foundation commissions the Flexner Report. In 1910, the report is published. In 1912, Flexner joins the Rockefeller General Education Board and begins distributing hundreds of millions of dollars to compliant schools. In 1913, the first grants go to Johns Hopkins, the school Flexner had attended, and the school his brother's employer, Rockefeller, was already funding. By 1935, more than half of American medical schools no longer exist. Every step follows logically from the one before it. Every institution involved has a documented financial relationship with the others. And the result is a medical system that looks exactly like what those institutions would have designed. Expensive, centralized, pharmacologically dependent, and controlled by a credentialing apparatus that makes entry nearly impossible without massive capital. Total national health expenditure in the United States reached $5.3 trillion in 2024. That is 18% of the entire gross domestic product. Per capita, health spending was $15,474, more than double what most European nations spend per person. The pharmaceutical market alone was valued at $634 billion. Hospital care accounted for over $1.5 trillion. Physician and clinical services added another $900 billion. The average emergency room visit now costs over $2,200. The average medical student graduates carrying $200,000 in debt from a program that costs between $160,000 and $272,000 in tuition. The United States spends more per person on healthcare than any country on earth, and by most measures of population health, life expectancy, infant mortality, chronic disease prevalence, it performs worse than dozens of nations that spend a fraction as much. The system is not failing. The system is functioning exactly as it was restructured to function. It produces revenue, it restricts supply, it consolidates authority, it eliminates competition, and it traces its architecture to a single report written by a man with no medical training, funded by the Carnegie Foundation, implemented with Rockefeller money, and enforced by the AMA, the same organization that had lobbied for those reforms in the first place. Abraham Flexner's report is still cited as one of the most important documents in the history of American medicine. It is taught in medical schools. It is praised in medical journals. The Flexner Report's 100th anniversary in 2010 was celebrated with symposia, retrospectives, and commemorative publications. And the reforms did raise standards, but they also closed 5 of 7 black medical schools, creating a physician shortage in black communities that has never been corrected. They eliminated every homeopathic, eclectic, and naturopathic program in the country, consolidating American medicine into a single pharmacological model. They cut the number of medical students in half, creating an artificial scarcity that persists to this day. The AAMC projects a shortage of up to 86,000 physicians by 2036. And they created the financial architecture for a $5.3 trillion industry that the average American can barely afford to use. Think about that for a moment. The next time you sit in a waiting room for 2 hours or receive a bill for a 15-minute consultation that costs more than a week's groceries, or hear that your nearest hospital is closing because it cannot sustain itself financially, consider that the system producing those outcomes was designed in 1910 by a school teacher from Louisville, funded by the richest oil baron in history, and implemented by an organization whose explicit goal was to restrict the number of people allowed to practice medicine. The report is 346 pages. It is freely available online. It has never been classified, challenged, or retracted. And the system it built, the most expensive healthcare system in human history, has never been asked to justify its origins against its outcomes. If the people who funded that report did not fund it to serve patients, then who exactly were they building this system to serve? And if the answer is in the financial record sitting in the Carnegie Foundation's own archive, why does nobody in the system ever assign it as reading?